Deep inside the heavily guarded walls of the Forbidden City, in a room smelling faintly of sandalwood incense and old paper, a small circle of imperial scholars made a decision that would eventually condemn millions of their own people to death. It was the late 1430s. The men gathered in this room didn't order a massacre, and they didn't launch a war. They simply signed off on a bureaucratic policy. They ordered the dismantling of the greatest navy the world had ever seen. They halted construction on all ocean-going vessels, restricted coastal trade, and, according to historical tradition, burned the blueprints of their massive treasure ships so they could never be built again. They believed they were saving the Ming Dynasty's economy. In reality, they were handing the future of the world over to Europe. By dragging a vast, outward-looking empire inward, they created a global power vacuum. Half a century later, Portuguese caravels would round the coast of Africa and begin claiming the Indian Ocean. Centuries after that, Western ironclads would sail unchallenged up the Yangtze River, shatter China's borders, and spark devastating conflicts like the Taiping Rebellion, which alone claimed 20 million lives. The slow, violent collapse of imperial China and the rise of Western global dominance can be traced back to the ink drying on these specific edicts. To understand the sheer magnitude of what these scholars threw away, you have to rewind 30 years to a moment when China was looking outward. It is 1405, and the Ming Dynasty is the undisputed master of human engineering. On the banks of the Yangtze River, outside the city of Nanjing, sits the Longjiang shipyard. It is a sprawling, 400-acre industrial marvel. The air here is thick with the sharp tang of boiling tung oil, used to waterproof timber, and the heavy scent of raw pine and cedar. From dawn until dusk, the shipyards echo with the deafening, rhythmic strikes of 30,000 shipwrights, carpenters, and blacksmiths working in unison. They are building the Baochuan, the treasure ships. Nothing like them has ever existed, and nothing like them will exist again for hundreds of years. The largest of these vessels are floating leviathans, measuring nearly 400 feet long and over 150 feet wide. They feature 9 towering masts bearing sails made of red silk. Beneath the deck, the hulls are divided into watertight bulkheads. If a treasure ship strikes a reef and one section floods, the water is contained and the ship sails on. It is a brilliant piece of maritime engineering that European navies won't fully adopt until the late 1700s. To put the sheer scale of the Ming fleet into perspective, look at the ships that would later cross the Atlantic. When Christopher Columbus stumbled into the Americas in 1492, his flagship, the Santa Maria, was roughly 60 feet long. You could park the entire Santa Maria on the main deck of a single Chinese treasure ship and still have enough room to drill a battalion of infantry. And the Ming Dynasty didn't just build one of these. For their maiden voyage, they built a fleet of over 300 vessels, carrying a crew of nearly 28,000 men. It was a floating metropolis, complete with specialized ships carrying fresh water, cavalry horses, meteorologists, translators, and foreign diplomats. The architect behind this unprecedented display of power was Zhu Di, the Yongle emperor. Zhu Di was a usurper. He had seized the dragon throne by waging a brutal 3-year civil war against his own nephew. When he finally breached the capital, the imperial palace burned to the ground, and his nephew's body was never definitively identified. Because of this, Zhu Di was plagued by rumors of illegitimacy. He was deeply paranoid, fiercely ambitious, and desperate to prove that he possessed the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule. He moved the capital to Beijing. He ordered the construction of the Forbidden City. But domestic projects weren't enough. He needed the known world to bow to him. He wanted to establish a tribute system across the oceans, where foreign kings would acknowledge China as the center of the universe. To command this terrifying armada, the Yongle Emperor needed a man he could trust absolutely. He couldn't rely on the traditional Confucian scholars who ran his government. They were tied to the land, steeped in tradition, and quietly judged him for his violent rise to power. Instead, the emperor turned to a man who existed entirely outside the traditional power structure. His name was Ma He, though history remembers him by his imperial title, Zheng He. Zheng He was not ethnically Han Chinese, and he was not born into nobility. He was a Muslim from the mountainous southern province of Yunnan. When he was just 10 years old, Ming armies invaded his homeland. His father was killed, and the boy was taken captive. Like many young male prisoners of war, he was castrated and forced into servitude within the imperial household. Eunuchs occupied a strange space in the Ming hierarchy. Because they could not father children, they could not build rival dynasties. This made them entirely dependent on the emperor, which in turn made them the emperor's most trusted agents. The brutal, unforgiving environment of the military camps did not break the young Zheng He. Instead, it forged him. He grew to be physically imposing. Legend describes him as being 7 feet tall, with a voice like a ringing bell, and he became a brilliant tactical commander during Zhu Di's rebellion. When the Yongle Emperor looked at the vast fleet sitting in the Yangtze, he knew exactly who was going to lead it. In 1405, Zheng He stood on the deck of his flagship, gave the order, and the greatest armada in human history caught the monsoon winds. They sailed south to Vietnam, through the Strait of Malacca, and out into the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. They were not explorers looking for new lands. They knew exactly where they were going. They were seeking submission. They arrived at ports in Java, Sri Lanka, and Calicut, offering chests of exquisite silk and porcelain, expecting the local rulers to offer tribute and acknowledge the Ming Emperor's supremacy. If a kingdom refused, the velvet glove came off. When a notorious pirate king tried to ambush the fleet in the Strait of Malacca, Zheng He did not just fight him off. He annihilated the pirate armada, slaughtered 5,000 men, and dragged the pirate king back to Nanjing to be publicly beheaded. For nearly 3 decades, across 7 epic voyages, Zheng He pushed the boundaries of Ming influence all the way to the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. Foreign ambassadors flocked to the Ming court. Exotic tribute, including Arabian horses, ostriches, and even a live giraffe, which the Chinese court mistook for a mythical beast, flowed into the capital. The oceans belonged to China. But while Zheng He was projecting invincibility abroad, a vicious political war was brewing back in Beijing. The Confucian bureaucrats, the men who actually managed the empire's ledgers, were watching the treasury hemorrhage silver to fund these expeditions. They despised the foreign merchants. They despised the concept of overseas expansion. And above all, they deeply, bitterly hated the eunuchs who were gaining power from it. They couldn't stop the fleet as long as the Yongle Emperor was alive. But emperors are mortal, and the scholars were very, very patient. In the summer of 1424, that patience was rewarded. Far beyond the Great Wall, while leading yet another grueling military campaign against the Mongols, the Yongle Emperor fell ill and died. His body was quietly sealed in a tin coffin to prevent the smell of decay from alarming the troops, and the throne passed to his eldest son, Zhu Gaoji. The new ruler, the Hongxi Emperor, was everything his warlord father was not. He was physically frail, suffered from severe gout, and spent his days reading classical literature rather than riding horses. More importantly, he was deeply loyal to the Confucian scholars who had tutored him since childhood. For the bureaucrats in Beijing, this was the moment they had been waiting for, to strike back at the eunuchs. On the very day he officially took power, the new emperor issued an edict that sent shockwaves through the naval command. All oceanic voyages were suspended immediately. Shipwrights at the Longjiang shipyards were ordered to drop their tools and return to their home provinces. The massive treasure ships, some still in dry dock half-finished, were left to sit. To understand why the bureaucrats moved so swiftly and ruthlessly to kill the fleet, you have to look at the world through a traditional Confucian lens. In their philosophy, the ideal society was agrarian, self-sufficient, and rigidly structured. Farmers, who pulled food from the earth, were viewed as the noble backbone of the empire. Merchants, who simply moved goods around for a profit, were viewed as societal parasites. From the perspective of the scholars, Zheng He's massive armada was not a glorious symbol of Ming power. It was an offensive, catastrophic waste of resources. The fleet wasn't a commercial enterprise designed to make money. It was state-sponsored theater. The emperor demanded foreign kings submit to him, and in return, he bestowed lavish gifts of silk, porcelain, and silver upon them to show his benevolence. The Ming treasury was literally paying foreign nations to acknowledge China's superiority. Worse yet, the voyages empowered the eunuch class, placing massive military and financial resources into the hands of men the scholars viewed as corrupt, uneducated, and dangerously ambitious. Why empty the national coffers to bring back black pepper, ivory, and exotic animals? China was the Middle Kingdom, the center of the universe. It already possessed everything it needed. Zheng He, the towering admiral who had ruled the Indian Ocean, was quietly sidelined. He was given a respectable title as the defender of Nanjing, but effectively he was grounded. The Grand Fleet was chained to the docks. The sails were locked away in warehouses, slowly turning to dust. But the fleet had a brief, unexpected stay of execution. The Hongxi Emperor died of a heart attack less than a year into his reign, passing the throne to his son, the Zhuande Emperor. This new ruler found himself facing a diplomatic crisis. With the treasure ships off the water, foreign tribute had dried up. Peripheral kingdoms, no longer awed by the floating Chinese cities, stopped sending envoys to Beijing. The empire's prestige was fracturing. In 1430, desperate to remind the known world of Ming supremacy, the emperor ordered one last expedition. Zheng He was now in his 60s, his body worn down by decades of warfare and sea travel, but he answered the call. The shipyards were hastily reactivated. Hulls were patched, rotting rigging was replaced, and in 1431, an armada of over 100 vessels sailed out into the South China Sea. It was a magnificent voyage, retracing the old routes through Southeast Asia, India, and the Arabian Peninsula. But it felt like a farewell tour. And for the great admiral, it was. On the return journey, somewhere off the Malabar coast of India, Zheng He died. There was no grand state funeral in the capital for the man who had mapped the oceans for China. His men simply slipped his body into the waters of the Indian Ocean, and the fleet sailed home without its soul. When the ships finally limped back into the Yangtze River in 1433, the political climate in Beijing had hardened into something far more dangerous. The brief window of exploration was permanently shut. The Zhuande Emperor would soon die, leaving a young boy on the throne and placing absolute, uncontested power in the hands of the Confucian bureaucracy. The scholars now had a practical reason to abandon the sea, one that went beyond ideology. The Ming Empire was facing an existential threat. To the north, the Mongol tribes were unifying under a brilliant and ruthless warlord named Asen Taishi. Mongol cavalry were probing the borders, raiding villages, and threatening the northern frontier. Suddenly, naval dominance felt utterly irrelevant. You cannot sail a treasure ship across the Gobi Desert. You cannot fight heavy cavalry with an ocean fleet. The government needed to funnel every ounce of silver, iron, and manpower into northern defense. They needed to expand the Great Wall, and to keep the northern armies fed, they embarked on one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history: the renovation of the Grand Canal. This massive artificial waterway allowed grain barges to travel from the fertile south directly up to Beijing, entirely inland. By rebuilding the canal, the Ming government eliminated the need for a coastal navy to transport food. The ocean was no longer a highway to be mastered. It was a vulnerability to be sealed off. The bureaucracy went to work systematically dismantling the maritime infrastructure. New edicts were drafted, far harsher than the ones that had grounded Zheng He. Building a ship with more than 2 masts was declared a capital offense. Coastal populations were ordered to destroy their larger fishing vessels. But simply letting the great ships rot in the harbor wasn't enough for the most radical factions in the capital. They wanted to ensure that no future emperor, no ambitious eunuch, and no rogue admiral could ever resurrect the fleet. They didn't just want to dismantle the ships, they wanted to erase the very memory of how to build them. They wanted to erase the very memory of how to build them. Around the year 1477, a powerful eunuch who had caught the ear of the ruling emperor attempted to review Zheng He's original navigational charts and ship blueprints, hoping to launch a new expedition. When the request reached the Ministry of War, the bureaucrats panicked. According to historical tradition, the Vice Minister of War went down into the imperial archives, gathered every logbook, every map, and every architectural schematic detailing the construction of the treasure ships, and threw them into the fire. Whether they were literally burned to ash or simply hidden away until the paper rotted, the result was the same. The accumulated naval knowledge of a superpower vanished overnight. The veteran shipwrights who held the physical know-how died off without passing on their trade. The colossal dry docks on the Yangtze slowly filled with river silt. The giant rudders and heavy iron anchors were broken down, melted in furnaces, and reforged into weapons for the northern frontier. By the dawn of the 1500s, China's Grand Armada was nothing more than a myth. The Ming government believed that closing the ocean would bring order. Instead, it brought absolute chaos. By criminalizing maritime trade, the bureaucrats instantly turned thousands of honest coastal merchants into outlaws. Without a formidable navy to patrol the waters, a massive piracy crisis erupted along the coast. These pirates, known as the Wokou, ravaged the eastern seaboard, burning coastal villages and slaughtering civilians. The state's solution to this self-inflicted wound was even more drastic. They ordered entire coastal populations to move miles inland, abandoning perfectly good land and leaving a desolate, heavily militarized dead zone along the ocean. China was locking its own front door and throwing away the key. But the ocean doesn't sit empty just because one empire decides to look away. On the opposite side of the Eurasian landmass, a minor, impoverished kingdom perching on the edge of the Atlantic was looking out at the water. While Ming officials were making it a capital offense to sail a 2-masted ship, the Portuguese were obsessively studying how to tack against the wind. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope. By 1514, Portuguese ships had crossed the Indian Ocean and reached the southern coast of China. The European vessels that first arrived were crude and small compared to Zheng He's Leviathans. If the Ming fleet had still been actively patrolling the South China Sea, the Portuguese would have been brushed aside as a minor nuisance, heavily outgunned and outmanned. But there was no Ming fleet to stop them. The oceans were entirely uncontested. The Portuguese were soon followed by the Spanish, the Dutch, and the British. Without a Chinese navy projecting power, Western empires systematically claimed the global sea lanes, establishing fortified trading posts, monopolizing the flow of spices and silver, and funneling the wealth of the world back to Europe to fund the Industrial Revolution. By the 19th century, the geopolitical scales had completely flipped, and the bill for the Ming dynasty's isolationist pivot finally came due. In 1839, the British arrived off the coast of China, not with wooden caravels, but with heavily armed, iron-hulled steamships. The First Opium War shattered the illusion of Chinese invincibility. Western gunboats sailed straight up the Yangtze River, past the exact spots where the Longjiang shipyards once stood, bombarding coastal cities into submission. The forced, violent opening of China shattered the state's authority and led to devastating internal instability. It created the conditions for the Taiping Rebellion, a cataclysmic civil war that killed up to 20 million people and left vast swaths of the country in ruins. The profound tragedy of this era wasn't just that these people died, or that an empire fell. It was that the mechanism to prevent this collapse had once existed, sitting right there in the Nanjing harbors, before being deliberately thrown away by their own government 400 years earlier. History is often shaped by massive, unavoidable collisions, earthquakes, plagues, or the migrations of nomadic hordes. But sometimes, history pivots entirely on the quiet stroke of a bureaucrat's brush. The Ming dynasty's decision to burn its fleet was driven by highly rational fears, a depleted treasury, corrupt political rivals, and genuine military threats on the northern border. They chose what felt like the safe, stable path. But in an interconnected world, retreating inward is often the most dangerous choice a civilization can make. By refusing to shape the future of the oceans, Ming China ensured that the future would eventually come for them, arriving on the very tides they had chosen to ignore. If you found this dive into the lost Ming fleet fascinating, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe. History is full of these sliding door moments where a single decision in a closed room changes the globe, and we're exploring them every week. Let me know in the comments below. If China hadn't burned its ships, do you think their treasure fleets would have crossed the Pacific? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.